Welcome to a new episode of Josh's Car Corner, the newest episode of Project Crewman, and another huge milestone in the rebuilding of the Crewman, because by the time this episode is over, this block right here is going to look like an engine. Now, to remind everybody what we have right here, this is an L92 Silverado truck block, so aluminum 6.2 liter, and I put the rotating assembly together in a previous episode of Josh's Car Corner. If you want to check that out, I'll put a link to it right up here in the upper right hand corner. You can check that out for yourself. But I just got the last order of parts in I needed to put this engine together. This episode is going to be heavily supported by both Improved Racing and, once again, Michigan Motorsports. I ordered the last cache of parts I needed from them once again, and they did a great job, got them to me in a couple of days. Prices, again, very reasonable, and they were very helpful, making sure I had everything that I needed to get this done. And on top of that, they also sell parts from Improved Racing. And there are going to be a bunch of Improved Racing parts going on this motor once again, just to make sure I've got maximum oil control, because it is a front sump engine, so there are considerations you have to take into account about making sure you've always got a good amount of oil going through the engine when you have a front sump motor. First thing I have to do is get the engine off of the engine stand, because the very first thing I have to do is put the rear engine cover on. But before I do that, I'm going to replace the barbell, which you've seen before on a previous episode with the GTO, but I'm going to show it to you once again here, and we're going to get started. Okay, the first step is to get the old barbell out. Now, the simplest way to do this is just to drill a hole in it, a tiny hole, and then get like a wood screw and just thread it in there, and eventually this whole thing will start turning. And once it starts turning, you can just get a claw hammer under it, get the fingers in there, and just pops right out. Very simple. And I will be replacing it with, as I did on the GTO, one of the Improved Racing barbells. These are made of billet, and they've got a nice new seal on them. And the best part, they tapped a hole in the outside of it, so if you ever need to remove this, you just thread an M5 screw in there and you pop it right out. Very simple. So I'm just going to put a little bit of oil on this thing just to lubricate it so it'll go in easier. Okay, then we'll go ahead and slide this guy in. Fits nice and tight, really tight, which is good. It means it'll seal. Snap it in. There we go. The rear engine cover will actually hold it in place. It's actually got an indentation in it to keep that pushed in. Now it's time to do the new rear engine cover, and I have got myself to help me with this an alignment tool. The rear engine cover you typically wouldn't worry about, except if you didn't have a new rear main seal installed in the cover already. That kind of helps align this part of the cover when you go to set it in, but not everyone's going to have that scenario, and they're going to put the seal in at a later point. So to make sure it's aligned, I got this brace. I got a whole kit off of Amazon. It actually came with a big, kind of like a socket to put over here to make sure that the cover is perfectly aligned if you didn't have a gasket. This is just a plate to make sure it would be level with the oil pan surface when you go to bolt it down. So that's what I've got in here right now. So I'll just get the rear cover. This rear cover is nice because it comes complete with a new seal. It comes with a new gasket for the rear engine cover and all new bolt hardware. What we need to do is just start to slide it on. And what's going to happen is it's going to push this little plastic piece out. This is just there to help kind of align the seal when you go to install it. So get a bolt started here. Okay, that bolt's in. I'll get another top bolt started. There we go. See, it's starting to pop the little cap out. This will actually start to push it on. We'll just do these top ones first. What's going to happen is the other ones will just start to slowly get pushed out. The gasket's what's holding them in. So as you torque these down, it'll just slowly push it all out. But then it can't travel up and down very much, but I will hold this up just to make sure it's nice and level with where the oil pan is going to be. So I will get a wrench so I can start to tighten these a little easier. Okay, I've now got all of these bolts snugged up. They are aligned on the bottom. I can feel it here with my finger. There is no torquing pattern to this, so I just like to work from the top down. So all these bolts get 18 foot-pounds. Got the torque wrench set. I'll just work my way across, and then the rear engine cover's on, and I can get this thing back on the engine stand. Now it is time to put the camshaft in, however. If you go back a few episodes ago within Project Crewman, you'll see that I was talking about putting DOD in this motor. And a lot of you out there I heard going,
"No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!"
But I want you to know that DOD is no longer going to happen. The main reason being that it would actually cost me more money to put DOD in this engine, and I would end up with less power. And that kind of math in my head just simply does not work. So what I decided to do is go with a cam I already had, the cam I've had sitting on the shelf for God knows why for the past 11 years, the stock cam out of the LS2 from the GTO. So 206 degrees of advertised duration intake, 213 exhaust with 525 lift and a 116 lobe separation angle. This is going to be good. I originally did not want to go with this cam because I thought I was going to lose a bit of low end torque, and being an automatic that's going to be running around a lot in 5th and 6th gear, I didn't want to give that up. But then I realized I was going to be adding a half point of compression back to this motor by going with the cathedral port heads. So I'm probably going to get that little loss of torque back, and this thing is going to have a really strong mid-range as a result, and it's going to be cheaper to put together, and like I said, end up making more power. Now, this is not an all-out power machine, don't really care about max power, but you know, power is always nice to have. So I'm gonna lube this thing up again with some assembly lube, slide it back in there, and then we'll start putting the front of the engine together and get that front cover on. Bingo. She is back in, slippery as ever. All right, that part's done. Next thing to do is put the tensioner on, but not tighten it down just yet. Okay, here's my new tensioner. This is actually the Gen 4 style tensioner that is used on the later Gen 4 motors. If you've ever taken apart a GTO motor, it's got that plastic bit that sits in here that's just got the two concave surfaces. It doesn't really tension, it just kind of picks up oil off of the chain, and I think it might keep this side of it, the loose side of the chain, from slopping around a little bit, but it's not providing tension. Now, a lot of guys who build high horsepower applications swear by those and say those are the better way to go. I'm not sure why. I don't know why you wouldn't want to have a tension chain. And also, these edges will be good for scraping oil off and getting it back into the motor so it's not slopping around. One thing I just noticed about this is here's the little key that you use to keep tension on the thing while you're setting it in place. They had it on the backside taped on here, not setting tension. I suppose they did that just to make sure that the spring stays taut until you're actually ready to use it. So I just got to push this little finger right here until I can see the hole, and I can push this through. So now that is pre-tensioned. Like I said, I'm not going to tighten this all the way on just yet. I'm just going to get it started because you don't want to torque this until the chain is actually in there. And then once the gear and everything else in the chain is on and everything is set, then I will tighten this down and go ahead and tension it. Okay, next thing that needs to go on is the cam retainer plate. Now, anytime you're taking the cam out of a motor and installing a new one, you need to replace this plate. I know it's solid steel and it looks like you could reuse it, but this seal is what matters. It blocks this entire oil passage right here, and if this thing is leaking, you lose oil pressure to your lifters and your valve train, and you don't want that. So for 20 some bucks, replace this every time. Now, because I'm building this from a bare block, I didn't get a lot of the bolt hardware, so I'm also having to replace all of the bolts as I go. Now, fortunately, Michigan Motorsports does carry all of the bolt hardware for everywhere on this motor. So for the cam retainer bolts, they stock the ARP bolts. Now, these are never going to take the same amount of torque as factory bolts would because they are made of much stronger steel, so they have different tensile strength. And what you'll usually find with an ARP bolt is it requires less torque than the factory bolt would. So these bolts from the factory, I believe, are 26 foot-pounds. ARP only wants 25 foot-pounds for their bolts, and they want you to use their Ultra Torque pre-lube on the heads and on the last few threads too. So I'm going to get these all lubed up so they're ready to go, and then I will get this thing torqued down and installed. Now it's time to put the new gear on. So here is the new gear I got, again from Michigan Motorsports. This is the 4X cam gear. This is what I can use because I'm running the E38 computer with the 58X crank trigger. If you were running a 24X motor and you were using the E40 computer from a GTO, you'd have the 1X gear, which has just got one big on pattern and then the rest of it is an off pattern. This has got 4 on patterns and then 4 off patterns. Now I wanna make clear on these things because I think some people get confused. The dowel hole where the cam gear lines up on the camshaft, this is not the alignment hole for top dead center. If you look around the circumference here, right along the teeth, there's a little divot right here. You can see that? That is your TDC mark. So when you set the cam in here, you want to rotate it around so this is pointing straight down. It should be going through this hole on the tensioner and it should be lining up with the dimple in the gear on the crankshaft. Now looking at this, I can see that my crankshaft is still a little bit advanced from TDC, so I'm going to get out my 24 and I'm going to turn the crank just a little bit to get this to TDC. Once these are all aligned, then you can put the chain on. But you can't put the chain on with the gear on the cam, which is why I haven't installed it. You have to put the chain on and then you kind of got to work it up here onto the dowel. Now once I've got the chain on there and the gear back on the camshaft, then I can put on my new cam gear bolts. Once again, ARP bolts, and just like the tensioner bolts are going to be 25 foot-pounds, I got to use the lube again, but I will get started with that and then we'll get tightening. All right, now looking at this chain, sometimes you see this. There's one link that is black while all the others are silver. I like to put that one directly across from this dot, so it's at the very top. That way I know that when this is straight at the top and I'm lining it up on the crank gear, that I've got this still lined up with TDC. So the way you want to do this is you have to kind of wiggle it into and around the chain and around the tensioner. You have to figure out where that home is. All right, kind of get like that. Now I gotta turn the cam just a little bit more. All right. All right, that is on there and it's lined up. Okay, so I should be able to put a bolt in now to hold it. There we go. I got one in there now to start it, but just looking at this, I can see that the dot right here is pointed straight down through the tensioner and at the dot on the crank. So this is in time. Now what I can do is I can lube up these other 2 bolts, get them in there, then I can pull the other one out, lube it, get it in there. I'm gonna do that before I tighten the tensioner bolts, just to make sure that the cam is tight first. Okay, there we go. Just gotta rub a little bit of this thread lube off of here. Okay, all right. That is done. Now I'm just going to turn this down to 18 foot-pounds and I'll go ahead and torque down the tensioner quick. Okay, done. So that's all torqued. Now I can pull this guy out and we have tension. I'm going to go ahead and put a little more assembly lube all around the chain here to make sure all of these links have got enough, because this thing will spin around a few more times probably before it finally gets oil and is ready to fire. So the more assembly lube that's in here, the better. All right, that is good. Now time for the oil pump, and it's time to show you how to align it properly in a way I've never done it before, AKA the right way to do it. Okay, now it's time to put the oil pump on, and this time I am doing something that I have never done before, but when I saw it done, it absolutely clicked in my head and made perfect sense to me. So you don't see oil pumps like this very often. What I've done is I've taken the front cover off of the pump and exposed the gears inside. So you get an idea how these oil pumps work. You've got 2 gears here and they are offset. So what happens is there's gaps on this side of the gear and there are no gaps on this side of the gear. So what happens is this creates vacuum. So it's sucking oil out of the pan, it's pressurizing it, and then it's shooting it out over on this side as the gaps between the gears close up. So what's not done by most people, and what Melling doesn't even tell you to do, is align the pump to the block. See, the bolts have got, the holes have got gap in them, and this thing can move around a little bit, and the problem is this outside gear has to be perfectly centered in the housing. If it's not, if it's like sitting on one side or the other, you can have problems because there's about 5 thousandths clearance between this outer gear and the body of the oil pump itself. If it's sitting on the bottom and there's no clearance here, but there's 5 thousandths here, you're gonna have a gap for oil here, but no gap here, and you can have metal on metal. So you really wanna make sure that this outer gear is perfectly centered in the pump. So what the guy who did this online, I think his paid channel is That Engine Guy or something like that. I'll put another link up in this corner right here to his video so you can see the way he did it, but I basically replicated what he did. So I took 2 of my feeler gauges out. I've got the 2 10,000ths feeler gauge up here on top, and I've got the 25 10,000ths gauge here on the bottom. I just wiggled the pump back and forth until I was able to slide these in. So they're not the same diameter, but I don't have a second 2 10,000ths one to put in here, so I had to use the 2.5. I don't think it would be possible to get 2 25 10,000ths feeler gauges in here. I just think it's just way too tight, but this is enough. So I've gone for just a tiny more gap down here than up here. I figure more oil in the bottom is better. So now that these feeler gauges are in here and they're opposed to each other and they're centered, I'm gonna go ahead and torque down the oil pump and give it its 18 foot-pounds. Then I'm gonna take these feeler gauges out and I'm just gonna check and make sure the gear is free and loose in here, which it should be. Okay, so that is done. Now I can pull the feeler gauges out of there. There we go. And then I can pull my 25 out. Okay, so now this gear should be able to still move in here very easily, and it does. It wiggles all around. It can slide in and out. Okay, so now it's perfectly centered. Now all I gotta do is get some blue Loctite and just put it on the ends of these screws that I took out, and they get 106 inch-pounds. Not foot-pounds, 106 inch-pounds, which I think is like 8.8 foot-pounds or something like that. Put the front cover back on, and I am done under here, and I can put the whole front engine cover on once I'm done. Okay, one last thing to do for the time being, and that is to put the front engine cover on. This is where that alignment kit for the covers, it comes in handy. So we've got this brace along the bottom here that the cover bolts to, and then it bolts to the block to make sure it's absolutely vertical and upright and level with the bottom of the block. And then we've got this piece in here. You put this in without the seal in it, and it perfectly centers this thing on the snout of the crank. So now I just gotta take my torque wrench, switch it back to foot-pounds, dial it up to 18, and do these 8 bolts. These are ARP bolts. Once again, didn't have the factory ones. This is what Michigan Motorsports keeps on the shelf for the front cover, and I am just fine with that. No instructions with these bolts, so that means ARP doesn't have a torque specification for them, and I have found that when they don't provide a torque specification, use the factory torque specification, which is 18 foot-pounds. Okay, there we go. So that'll do it for now. Tomorrow will be an exciting day. I've got more parts from Improved Racing coming for the bottom of the engine. Then I can put the pan on. And then once that's done, it is time for the heads. Okay, the time has come to finally button up the bottom of this engine and put the oil pan on. But before I do that, I am going to put on something I just got in the mail yesterday, and that is an Improved Racing crank scraper. You know, if you're doing a LS motor and you're going to be using a front sump, you don't have a lot of oil capacity with the factory pan. At the most, you're going to get about 6 quarts. If you're going drag racing or something, you could add a little bit more for the races, but you wouldn't want to run around on the street with an overfill pan. So one of the best things you can do is get the oil back to the pan as quickly as possible. And one of the best ways to do it is with one of these Improved Racing crank scrapers, because not only will it get the oil off of the throws of the crank and get it back to the pan quicker, scraping it off the crank will keep it from rotating with the rest of the engine and actually free up a couple of extra horsepower. So not only are you making sure you've got more oil, you're picking up a few ponies at the same time. So this is a great modification to do. I did this on the GTO, and because this is also going to be front sump, happy to be doing it on the Ute as well. They give you some excellent instructions on how to put this thing on. It's a pretty simple process. So I'll move the camera here so you can see what I'm doing, and we'll get this guy installed. Okay, now the first step of this is dependent upon what kind of studs you are using for your main caps. Are you using the factory studs, or are you using upgraded ARP hardware? If you're using the factory stuff, they include these bushings that go in the 4 corners like this. I'll take one out here so you can see it. These bushings, they reduce the diameter because the factory studs have a smaller diameter than the ARP stuff does. If you're using the ARP stuff, you don't use the bushings at all. So the idea here is you just start by sliding it on here, and then we're going to put all the nuts on. There are 10 nuts, and what we're going to do is just tighten them down so they're snug but not tight. We need this to be able to move around a little bit, because once we've got all these nuts on, we're going to spin the motor. We need to make sure that we have clearance. And to do the clearance part, you are going to need a feeler gauge. If you don't have a set of feeler gauges, get one. It is important for this part. You have to make sure that nothing is going to hit as the motor is rotating around. These nuts are cut in kind of the same way as a nylock washer would be, so they have resistance once they get fully engaged. They don't want to turn back off. Best way I found to do this is just keep turning it until it stops and then go back about a quarter turn. That's enough to make sure that it's loose and it can move around. Okay, that can still move around here. Cool. Now I'm going to get my 24 out so I can spin the motor around. Because we're not worried about the 4-stroke cycle here, we only need to go around 360 degrees. So see how I've got this big dimple right here? That's top dead center on number 1. I'm just going to go around until I see that again. Okay, goes around without hitting anything. Now I'm going to check all of the crank throws individually when they're up to make sure we've got the clearance. So I'm just going to get my 20 thousandths out here. That's 10, 18, 19, 20. We need a minimum of 20 thousandths clearance in all the gaps. So we got 20 there, definitely got 20, 20. Yep, that's good. 20 there, 20 there, 20, 20, 20. That's good. Spin it around 90 degrees. Should have some new crank throws up. Here we go. 20, 20. Reason we're worried about 20 is thermal expansion. So aluminum and steel expand at different rates. So you need to have a clearance between them. It's the same deal as you would have with piston rings on pistons, because pistons are made of aluminum and the rings are made of steel. They expand at different rates. So you need to make sure that they're not going to make inadvertent contact with each other once they heat up. Back at top dead center. Good. Good. Okay, we are good everywhere. Now I can go ahead and finish torque all of these down. Okay, these are all torqued down now. These get 18 foot-pounds. The nice thing about this crank scraper is it also kind of doubles as a brace for all of the main caps too, because it's one piece of solid aluminum. It ties them all together, adds just a little more strength to the block. So that's another nice feature. Now all I have to do is get the Improved Racing Windage Tray on there as well. This is a lot simpler. There's only 6 holes that you have to worry about getting screws into. They supply the screws. They are a 4mm Allen key. I wouldn't use an Allen key though. I would definitely get a socket like this, because you are going to torque them. Not a lot, they're only going to get 5 foot-pounds, but you do want to get your torque spec right. So I would get this. There we go, all done. All right, that is it. The Improved Racing Windage Tray crank scraper combination is on here. I do still have to put on the new pickup tube for the oil pan, so that's going to be the next one. Okay, it is now oil pickup tube time, and I also want to say that I got this pan, pickup tube, dipstick, and everything I needed to do a front sump LS from Improved Racing. They used to sell these kits complete, everything you needed to put a front sump setup on an LS motor. When I purchased this kit, there were only 2 of these complete NOS kits left in their inventory. So I bought the second to last one, and somebody I know down south bought the last one. So if they don't have them anymore, now you have to piece these together yourself if you want to do a front sump system. But first thing I did is just took some oil and put it on the O-ring. Nice thing is they put the right O-ring on there for you right away, so you don't have to think about it. You just have to slowly slide it in and try to keep it as straight as you can. And it's got to work its way into the head of this pan or pump. There we go. So it's sitting like that. Now I'm going to do the same thing I did when I did the GTO, and I'm going to use one of those oil pickup tube braces on this thing to make sure it's clamped down on both sides and this rubber seal stays in here nice and tight. Some guys don't like to use these and put the extra bolt in. They say it's too difficult. I say grow a pair. It's really not that hard. Just use 1/4 inch sockets and it's fine. So we just need to have it set at 9 foot-pounds, which we do. Get this guy in here. We just need to be set at 9 foot-pounds. This is not a whole lot of torque. And be very careful because we are going into aluminum and we don't want to round this out. 7, 8, 9. Okay. Now I just need to tighten up this bolt back here again. This here is being held down by. That one, just like before, is 18 foot-pounds. Okay, and now I am finally ready to put the oil pan on this thing. Okay, just one thing I need to show you before I install this new oil pan. So first off, I got to clean that surface rust off of the transfer tubes, but this is one of those late front sump oil pans that actually has the oil pressure bypass valve in it. Now, the GTO didn't have this, but this one does, and when I was initially going to do DOD, this was a good thing. I wanted this, but now I'm not going to do DOD, so I got the improved racing bypass block off. So I'm going to pull this guy out. It's a 17 millimeter nut. I'll back that out, put that guy in, and no more bypass valve. Okay, I have got all the mating surfaces around here cleaned off with some brake cleaner. It is now time to put the oil pan on, but before I do that, I am going to use just a little bit of RTV. You might look at the modern gaskets and think they are so good, and they are really, really good, that nothing's ever going to leak. But you know, just for a little bit of peace of mind, we do have these gaps right here between the front and rear engine cover and the block. So I like to put a little RTV on top of those just to make those flat and level, and just make sure I've got absolute sealing there in those corners. So it doesn't take much, just a little bit on the end of your finger, and you just rub it in there and fill those tiny gaps. They're not big gaps at all. So I'm going to do that quick. And once that's done, I will go ahead and get the pan over here. Time for the pan. So just need to be careful when we set this guy on here that the pickup tube is going into its hole. There we go. We wouldn't want to inadvertently bend the pickup tube. Okay. So that guy's there. I'm just going to push here to get all the bolts to lift up. And these are all 10 millimeter bolts. So I'm going to go ahead and get them started by hand here and just get them down snug. Again, there's no torquing order with this. The goal is just to get them snug. But for me, I like to go front to back. So I'll do both the front ones and then I'll work my way back down each side, bouncing back and forth from side to side as I go down. Now before I go too much farther here, I am going to thread these back ones down because these have to go into the rear engine cover. So just to make sure that they are lined up, I'm going to start them, make sure they go in. These do. So that is lined up back there. If you have one that you find you can't get started by hand, the gasket's probably holding it a little crooked. Just go back a half turn on it and then try again, and it will usually line right up and start threading. Okay, I'm going to get started here, and like I said, I'm going to just work my way from front to back. Now all of these shorter bolts get 18 foot-pounds, so we'll get started with those. You know, one of the great things about these LS engines is how everything ties into everything else. So when you look at them, the front cover ties into the pan, the rear cover ties into the pan ties into the block, the front cover and the rear cover both tie into the block. Everything ties together, which is why a lot of people say that this is a structural part of the block, which it is, because everything is so integrated. But it's also the reason these aluminum blocks can handle 1,000 horsepower, is because they're just so well tied together and engineered. GM really did a good job when they came out with these blocks. Okay, so that's done. Now, the last two bolts. This is very important. These do not get 18 foot-pounds. Smaller diameter thread, less material to enter to. You do not want to put 18 on these, you will strip them right out. They only get 9 foot-pounds. So I've cranked my wrench down to 9. We'll get these guys torqued down. All right, just like that, the oil pan is installed. The bottom of the engine is done. Very exciting. So I'm going to get this thing rotated over and it'll be time to start putting the cylinder heads on. So as you can see, there is a lot that goes into putting an engine together. And as I was editing all of my footage, I realized the episode is starting to get pretty long. So I decided I'm gonna end it here, and the engine will get finished in the next episode. In that one, we'll be putting the cylinder heads on, the intake, the front accessory drives, everything that goes into making a complete engine. So thank you for watching this episode of Josh's Car Corner and Project Crewman. I will see you in the next one.